What do you think of when you hear the word Balloonomania? You probably think it has something to do with balloons, and you'd be right. But not the type of balloons you see at birthday parties. Today, we're going to be talking about the kind of balloons that take people up into the sky, hot air balloons. Now, there was a time when hot air balloons were all the rage. This was a time before airplanes and helicopters, a time when people were flying in the sky for the first time in history. Just over 200 years ago, thousands of people would gather on the ground to watch pilots drift up inside giant balloons. It was thrilling, terrifying, and very dangerous. These daring pilots were called aeronauts and were considered some of the bravest people of their time. One aeronaut made history as the first woman to take to the skies all by herself. She was so famous that she became a favorite of Napoleon, the King of France. Those who knew her never would have guessed she'd become an adventurous aeronaut. But that just comes to show you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. This is the story of Sophie Blanchard and her trip to the skies.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. It is time to take to the skies and go learn about an amazing tale of bravery and adventure. We'll be exploring the story of a daring aviator who made history. Sophie was the first woman to pilot a hot air balloon solo, and her incredible aerial feats made her a celebrity of her time. She was even the official aeronaut of Empress Josephine, the wife of Napoleon. Join us as we explore her fascinating life and career and learn about the lasting impact she made on the world of aviation.
Our story begins in 1804 in Marseille, France. Horses and carriages raced past on the cobblestone roads. Sophie Blanchard covered her ears to block out the sound. She didn't like loud noises. So much so that she found riding inside a horse-drawn carriage terrifying. Sophie looked over at her husband, Jean-Pierre, who was walking beside her. Many people considered him a bit of a daredevil. Unlike Sophie, he wasn't afraid of carriages or loud noises. In fact, he regularly put his life in danger. How? By taking a hot air balloon up into the sky. Hot air balloons were still very new at this time, and they had captured Europe's imagination. Thousands of people would gather on rooftops and in fields to watch these giant balloons drift up into the clouds. Newspapers called this Balloonomania. Balloonomania all began in 1783 when Sophie was a little kid. That year, two brothers named Joseph Michel and Jacques-Étienne Montgolfier experimented with giant balloons. They realized that if they heated the air under the balloon would rise into the air. They weren't quite sure why this happened, but it gave them an idea. Could these balloons carry people? In Versailles, the brothers got their giant balloon ready to conduct a public experiment. They wanted to prove it could carry living creatures. Can you guess who the first balloon passengers were? A sheep, a rooster, and a duck. The two brothers placed the animals in the balloon's basket and lit a pile of straw underneath. As the air under the balloon heated up, the basket began to rise into the air. The crowd was in awe. To think, the animals were flying. They had never seen anything like it. Thankfully, the experiment went smoothly. The sheep, the rooster, and the duck safely returned to the ground. It wasn't long before humans took to the skies. Riding in air balloons, people could fly for the first time in history. thousands of spectators would gather to watch balloons travel through the air. And soon, it was all anyone could talk about.
My lord speaks of balloons. My lady speaks of balloons. Tommy the footman and Betty the cook speak of balloons. Yea, and balloons shall be spoke of.
One newspaper printed.
The rage has now extended very considerably.
Another journalist wrote.
It has affected the most distant countries.
Soon, people could buy hats, ribbons, and fans that commemorated these flights. The future King of England was even seen wearing clothing decorated with balloons. Shops began selling plates, jewelry, and sword handles with a balloon theme. And toy makers crafted tons of toy balloons for kids. For months, it seemed like everyone's heads were in the clouds, Sophie Blanchard included. Just like everyone else, she marveled at the balloons gliding through the air. They were beautiful to watch. But not everyone was a fan. A lot of people were afraid of these giant balloons. Just imagine, if you had never seen anything like it before, you might find it scary too. One time, a balloon landed in a French village, and the villagers had no idea what it was. Terrified, they grabbed pitchforks and shredded it to pieces. And there was something else that worried people. What if these balloons were used in war? In England, people wondered if the French could invade with an army of air balloons. As it turns out, air balloons were not very good in warfare. There were also people who didn't like watching the balloons. They were terrified something horrible would happen. What if the balloonist flew into dangerous winds? What if the balloon deflated or caught on fire? Ballooning accidents did happen, and many risked their lives for a chance in the sky. Sophie's husband, Jean-Pierre, was one of the early balloonists. He fearlessly took a balloon across the English Channel, traveling from England to France. Up in the air, he put on shows to wow the crowds below. Sometimes he launched fireworks out of the balloon, which was very dangerous. One time, he even brought a dog up with him. When he was a mile up in the sky, Jean-Pierre attached his parachute to the dog and watched as the animal descended slowly to the ground. Thankfully, no dogs were hurt during this experiment. It was a good thing Jean-Pierre knew how parachutes worked. One time, his balloon was dropping too quickly out of the sky. He was afraid the balloon would burst. He poked holes into the balloon to stop it from tearing apart. Then, he cut the ropes and tied them to himself. The balloon acted as a parachute and brought him safely to the ground. Now, Jean-Pierre didn't just do this for fun. He also went ballooning to pay his bills. He toured around Europe, putting on demonstrations and charged for admission. At first, Jean-Pierre's stunts attracted huge crowds of people who paid for the chance to watch. But after a few years, the crowds began to disappear, and that meant he was running out of money. That's when he had an interesting idea. At that time, most of the balloonists were men. What if a woman took to the skies? Would that bring back the crowds? Jean-Pierre went to his wife, Sophie, with his idea. Would she join him on his next balloon ride?
Hi, young historians! Time for a quick break from this amazing story to tell you a bit more about honest history. If you're enjoying this episode, then you'll love Honest History's magazines and books. Each one is filled with important adventures through the past, like the story of Chen Yisao, a Chinese woman who commanded one of the largest pirate fleets in history, to Mansa Musa from Africa, one of the wealthiest people to ever live. You can pick up a copy or subscribe and receive 3 issues delivered straight to your doorstep every 3 months. Just go to honesthistory.co and use code ANYTIMENOW for a 10% discount. That's honesthistory.co and special promo code ANYTIMENOW. Okay, let's get back to the story.
imagine Sophie would have been a little afraid of balloons, considering how many dangerous stories she had heard. That's why people were shocked when she agreed to ride with Jean-Pierre. Small and nervous, Sophie didn't seem like the adventurous type. She didn't even like riding in carriages on the road. And now she was going to ride a balloon up in the air? As it turns out, people had underestimated her. In 1804, Sophie was 26 years old when she took her first trip to the skies. She stepped into the basket next to her husband and soon heard the sound of burning straw. It was heating the air underneath the balloon. It wasn't long before she felt the basket under her feet lift off the ground. Slowly, the balloon rose into the sky. Sophie looked at the earth beneath her. Everything seemed smaller up in the sky. And then she noticed something. Silence. Loud noises had always scared her, but up in the air, all she heard was the light whoosh of the wind and the creak of the balloon's ropes. Suddenly, she wasn't afraid.
It was an incomparable sensation,
Sophie said. When the balloon returned to the ground, Sophie was already planning her next flight. She flew with her husband during her second trip, but for her third trip, Sophie wanted to go alone. And this was revolutionary. No woman had ever piloted an air balloon by herself. In 1805, Sophie Blanchard arrived in Toulouse, France for this historic journey. It was a warm summer's day when her balloon lifted off the ground. She excitedly peered down at the gardens, churches, houses, and crowds of people beneath her. Sophie had just become the first woman to ever fly in an air balloon alone. And she wasn't going to stop there. Sophie continued to join her husband on his daring balloon journeys. It was during one of these journeys that something terrible happened. Sophie and Jean-Pierre were up in their hot air balloon when suddenly, Jean-Pierre collapsed. Sadly, he would not survive, and Sophie was left to support her family all by herself. She began flying balloons to make money, and, just like her husband, she needed to dazzle the crowds that came to watch. Dressed in elaborate clothing, Sophie was easy to spot in her small balloon. At night, she launched fireworks from the sky, and during the day, she experimented with parachutes. She became known for her daring performances, and crowds began cheering her name from the ground.
Madame Blanchard!
They shouted. Her fame soon caught the attention of France's leader, Napoleon Bonaparte. He made her the aeronaut of the official festivals, which meant that she would fly her balloon at important celebrations. In fact, Napoleon asked her to make an appearance at his own wedding. And when the King of France returned to rule, she became his favorite too. He dubbed her the official aeronaut of the Restoration. Of course, it wasn't easy being a female aeronaut. At that time, many people thought ballooning was too dangerous for women. But Sophie didn't listen to these critics and continued to do what she loved. Sophie traveled across Europe, from France to Germany to Italy in her small balloon. And everywhere she went, people flocked to watch her float through the sky. Flying solo, she quickly got the reputation as a bit of a daredevil. She soared to dangerous heights, where the air was so thin she could barely breathe. She weathered storms and traveled in the pitch-black night. And here's another thing about ballooning some people forget. It's freezing up in the sky. One time, Sophie was flying to Italy, and it was so cold she had icicles on her hands and face. During these daring flights, she had many near escapes. Sophie knew that she may not always be so lucky. Then, in 1819, she made her last flight at the age of 41. Her balloon tragically caught fire during the performance. News of the shocking event spread far and wide. All of Europe mourned Sophie's untimely end. But we have to remember, for 14 years, Sophie got to do something she loved. She got to travel up in the air and enjoy the beauty and quiet of the skies. And she got to show the world just how brave she really was. On the ground, she might have seemed quiet and nervous. But up in the sky, Sophie was fearless. So next time you're feeling a little nervous, you can think of Sophie Blanchard. She made history as the first woman to ever pilot an air balloon alone. When she was young, no one expected her to become a courageous aeronaut, but that's exactly what she did. And today, her legacy as a trailblazing aeronaut will never be forgotten.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Anytime Now. Have you ever ridden in a hot air balloon? If you ever get the chance to go on a ride, think about Sophie and how it must have felt like to be the first balloonist to take to the skies all alone. The thrill must have been incredible. Thankfully, today we have hundreds of years of aviation to learn from, and hot air balloon travel is much safer than when Sophie was flying. If you like this story, check out issue 3 of Honest History magazine, where you'll learn all about the Chicago World's Fair and some of the incredible inventions that were on display. Also, if this is your first time listening to our show, be sure to check out some of our previous episodes for more fascinating stories from history. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time. This episode was hosted by Tory Ward and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Randall, Lawrence, and Robot Pirate Media. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.
When you think about history, are there lots of old guys wearing wigs and stockings? When you think about history, is Napoleon really short? And folks have wooden teeth. Do you know that history can be the most incredible, amazing stories for you and me? Sit back and listen to a story right now. It's honest, it's fun, and it's sure to